It's time for Pure
Performance. Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, with me is my co-host, Andy Grabner. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Brian. How's it going?
Good. You know, I got to say, a couple of the last two podcasts we recorded with Donovan, they were in the afternoon, for me at least, which was awesome. I'm back to 9 a.m. recording and still waiting for that coffee to kick in. So it's back to the old grind of the recording schedule. But of course, we're recording early because we have, guests all over the world, which is really, really awesome. How's everything going with you, Andy? Before we get to the guest, anything momentous in your life?
Well, we just came off Cloud Foundry Summit here in Boston, which was very interesting, talking with people in that space. And I just also got off from another call with Donovan because, he promised us yesterday at the recording of the podcast that he's going to build integrations with TFS and DynaTrace and the Unbreakable Pipeline. And we just had a meeting, and he brought in one of his guys, and it seems this is going full steam ahead. So that's pretty cool.
That's really awesome.
Happy. Yeah.
We won't mention that because we're talking to a different.
Oh yeah, that's true. We're talking. So today, now let's switch over. Yeah. Well, the person that I want to let him introduce himself. But what I learned, and we both just learned, is we learned what this strange top-level domain LU stands for, and how it is possible that our guest today, evangelist on serverless technology with Amazon, how he ended up with an LU domain. And maybe I want to give it over to Danilo, and hopefully I got this name right, but please pronounce, I'm sure you know how to pronounce it best. But Danilo, can you please introduce yourself to the audience, and then we jump right into the topic, which is serverless, because that's your passion, and we want to enlighten our listeners.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. So my name is Danilo. You pronounce it perfectly. And as you said, I'm an evangelist in AWS, and I'm specifically focused on serverless technologies. I really enjoy the idea of building this application without having to think about servers. And the LU alias, it comes because when I started working for AWS, almost 6 years ago now, I relocated to Luxembourg. It's where the European headquarters of Amazon are, and then my email alias stuck.
Yeah, and for people that may not know and that are not that geographically versed, Luxembourg is a real country in Europe, it sits between Belgium, France, and Germany.
And
right?
Germany, it's really an interesting place. In 30 kilometers, you can change country, language. So it's a nice place to visit.
And as I was saying before, in my head, it's just filled from kilometer to kilometer with banks. Yeah. But I know I'm wrong, but that's what it is in my head.
Yeah, and by the way, 30 kilometers is about 20 miles. So just for people
insane. That's so insane.
Yeah, you're right.
So Danilo, I think the reason why we reached out to you, you're speaking at DEF1, or by the time this episode airs, you have spoken at DEF1, our conference in Linz, and I think the topic that you have been speaking about was serverless by design. And the other thing that you are doing, and depends on when this airs, we may just be close to it, or you're also going to be at the first AWS user group meetup in Linz, Austria in June. And I'm assuming that serverless is again going to be your topic. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're advocating right now? What are the key messages that you want to bring across for developers when it comes to serverless? What do people do wrong? What do they have to know when they get started?
I'm really attracted by this topic because when I start building my first, now we use the term serverless, but at the time there was no such term. My first application without servers in 2014, 2015, I really saw the speed, the velocity of building something and having it in production very quickly. So I think that it's the good side of serverless is that there are no dependencies, so you can just use the one of the languages that are supported by the platforms without any specific dependencies. That I think the things that people should probably dive deeper is the event-driven model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is actually something that I keep bringing up. So for me, serverless is kind of new. But I'm also very excited. So I wrote my first Node.js-based Lambda function early January. And the way I always say it, the biggest challenge that I had, and I didn't know about this in the beginning, I learned software engineering in the 90s. So I went through a high school with a focus on software engineering, and we learned, monolithic application development. And when I wrote my first Lambda function it was actually early this January, I thought, okay, I need to break down this big problem where I used to write a big function into smaller functions, and that kind of made sense. But then, and I think this is what you're alluding to here, I made the big mistake of the first piece of the function, or my first function that solved one part of the problem, called the second function, and the second function called the third function, and the third function called the fourth function, all waiting on each other, without really embracing event-driven programming, where I would basically pass state from one function via, I don't know, a DynamoDB table, via an SNS topic, something like that, to the next function that will potentially pick it up, right? And I think that was very hard for me to understand, and I think I made a lot of mistakes in the beginning.
Yeah, probably sequentially triggering functions is not really useful. But no, the idea is really so when you create a function, so functions is probably one of the most common example of serverless application. You create these functions in the cloud, they are triggered so that the business logic in this function is triggered by some event. And the idea is that you can link your business logic to how the data is changing. So for example, if a user of a mobile app is uploading a document or a picture, then this will trigger a Lambda function that can process this document or this picture and maybe extract information and then index this information in a database. As you said, a database may be a relational database or a database like DynamoDB. And then this can trigger maybe another function that can maybe put this new information in relation with other data that is in the database and create maybe an index or more structured content and so on. So that's the idea of chaining business logic with events that in some perspective can be business events, like a user uploaded something, a new user has registered to your service, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, so basically the state of your transaction is passed between the function through, as you said, some type of medium. It could be a database, and that makes perfect sense. And then you have all your events that then trigger other functions. So is there anything, again, coming back to my own experience, I think I started writing my first Node.js function lambdas, my set of lambdas, in the wrong way. Is there a way where people that want to start with serverless, where they should go, where they can learn some of these best practices? Yeah.
Oh, there's lots of examples that you can find. And I think something that we did as AWS is to create a repository. It's called the Serverless Application Repository, where people can publish and share their applications. So if you want to create something that is maybe a little bit more complex than a single function, like one example that I love is the classical URL shortener use case that is complex enough to bring some meanings, but simple enough to build it very quickly. So there's a user that shared that on the Serverless Application Repository, and you can go there and you can look at the code. It's open source code. You can see the parameters, and lots of best practices are already there. So you can really use this to kickstart your project, and then you can customize.
And you know what, Andy, I'll even make a plug, because I was thinking about this same topic here that you're going into. So I'll make a plug for your AWS Pipeline Repository up in GitHub. What's the name of that one?
Yeah, it's the AWS DevOps tutorial.
Yeah, so people look for that one too, because I think going back to, we recently had Josh Long on the show, and one of the points he was making is, instead of trying to tell people about stuff, obviously we're doing things in voice right now, but instead of trying to present people with slides, he shows people code. And even for me, the concept of serverless, I understood conceptually, but it still was a bit of an abstract idea until I actually saw the code written in your function in that repo. So if you're going to the repos that the Danilo is mentioning, or if you go to Andy's, you'll actually just see it's literally just some code.
Yeah.
And I think that really just makes it really clear, but it also gives you an idea then how this all gets done. So I'll also plug for yours as well there, as a, maybe not best practices because you're still learning the best practices, Andy, but I think you already learned a ton of lessons with it. And I'm sure your function's pretty solid by now. I don't mean to knock it at all. I just know you tell the stories about the things you went through. But yeah, I think taking a look at an actual function, clarifies it tremendously. Yeah. And we'll have, do you have, Danilo, what's the repository you're speaking of? Is that something we can find or you can send a link to so that we can provide that to our listeners?
Yeah, it's so in the AWS website, there's a serverless section, and in the serverless section, there's the link because this is a public repository that you can just browse. And then if you are logged in the console, you can also build this into your account. So you can build the implementation of the application in your account.
Okay, and I was just looking at the AWS serverless section before, and I do have to ask you then, and I apologize in advance for asking you this, but do they make you dress up as Sam the Squirrel when you go speak at places?
No, and the maximum is maybe to have a sticker or a T-shirt with the squirrel. So, but we love Sam.
You don't have to dress up as Sam, though. Okay, good. Andy, I don't know if you saw that there's a squirrel mascot for serverless.
No, I didn't see that. No.
Oh, yeah, check that out.
Yeah. So, Danilo, I got a question for you. So your talk is about serverless by design. What are the things that you can tell developers beside learning event-driven programming? What else is there to make sure you really leverage serverless the right way and with all the cool things that come with it, being flexible to deploy into production? I'm sure there are certain things where we want to promote canary releases and all that stuff. Can you give us an overview on what are the design principles to really leverage serverless?
Yeah, definitely. So my talk of that one is really Serverless by Design is a personal project that I built. It's open source in my GitHub account, and it's a web interface that you can use to design an event-driven architecture graphically. Basically, I map an event-driven architecture to a verted graphs for the mathematicians in the audience. And then this verted graph is translated into a template that you can use to build the first version of your application. So you can literally design, there is an S3 bucket where users can upload. I want to create an API gateway where users can interact from a mobile application, and this triggers a function. And then when you define the flow, and then you can output the template that can be used to build up the application. And this is probably another important best practice. So as soon as you go past 1, 2, 3 functions, the best way to keep the overall serverless application together is to use a template. So we created the serverless application model. It's an open source model that you can use to define the functions, the relationship between the functions, the triggers for the functions, and it's just a YAML file that will describe this with the syntax, and then you can pass this to a tool like CloudFormation that will build everything up. And this is the initial deployment. As you said, when you create a serverless application, you have lots of small components. In a way, you are adopting microservices with smaller functions that are triggered by events. And if you want to do an update, we now have this possibility to just with a few lines in this template to force a canary or a linear update. So you can say do a canary deployment for 10 minutes, and then if everything works, roll this out to all your users. Or you can do a more gradual deployment, like do a linear deployment where every 2 minutes or every 10 minutes add 10% of your users until everybody will have the new version. And this is something that we found out works very well when you have a large application, because you can test whatever you want in a synthetic environment, but only when you go in production you can really see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I think I just found your so it's a SBD.danilop.net, right? That's the serverless by design.
Yes,
that's
the implementation.
cool. Yeah.
It's actually working completely in the browser, so you can just download it and use it. So it's just a static website. It's completely running in the JavaScript side and on the browser.
Cool.
So I'm not using serverless for that.
Well, that's cool. That's pretty cool. But you should probably connect it then and upload some of these templates or blueprints then to a repository, right? That would be cool. That would be nice.
Yeah, actually, in the help section, if you go, there are a few examples. They're more to show the possibilities than to have really a meaning. But there's like how to set up a simple API or something.
Yeah. Oh, pretty cool.
Yeah, basically, this what I like of this tool is that I built it like in 3 days. Then, of course, there were more work on patching and stuff. But the first day was to choose the libraries, and 95% of the things that I do is built on top of other libraries that, like the network model, the graphical user interface. I just configure a library to do that.
Yeah. Cool. Hey, I got a couple of other questions for you. So thanks for that. I mean, that helps. You told us that event-driven programming is something that we need to understand, and event-driven architectures. From a developer experience perspective, and I remember when I started, right? You start with a function, you start with another function. Then I figured out there's certain code that I want to share between these functions. And then I put it into its own I was using Node.js. So what are the best practices here? What are the things people need to figure out once you grow from a few functions to, let's say, many functions that make up a complex application? How do you deal with with managing all this code? How do you share code components? How does that all work? Can you give us a little more detail on that and some developer best practices maybe?
Yeah, definitely. So working with lots of customers, I saw that, of course, every developer has their own peculiarities. But I think when you go past 2, 3, 5 functions, the idea of having a templating process like SAM or the serverless framework, it really helps because you have everything written down in files in a schematic format. And for example, with SAM, what you have is the possibility to automate packaging, deployment, updates, as I described before. So the next step is to set up a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. And it's super easy to do because you can use, for example, the AWS CLI and just package and deploy your source code starting from the template. It's 2 lines. For example, if you use my web tool, the output of when you build the template, I suggest you these 2 lines of code, and then you can use whatever tool you want. So if you have your own tools for building continuous integration, continuous deployment, you can just add these 2 lines as script to do the packaging and the deployment of the new version. Or you can use tools like Code Pipeline, Code Build, and Code Deploy that we built in AWS based on our internal tools.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Hey, and when you just talk about building and deploying and testing, I mean, when Brian and we have a big history in testing, and we are investing a lot in educating people on how to do proper CI/CD and baking also monitoring into CI/CD. When it comes to the pipeline, what's the best practice there? Are you deploying your Lambda function once and then you open it up through a certain API gateway to your tests that you run against it? Meaning tests would be, triggering the events that trigger the functions, or do we have special testing frameworks for actually testing these Lambda functions, or how does that work? How does automated testing work in a CI/CD world?
So for serverless application, we have all these modular functions. So what we suggest is to first build a very well-defined unit testing, maybe using a test-driven approach. So for every function, you should know the possible input cases and the outputs of each function. And we also provided a tool that you can use to generate the events, because the syntax that you can expect when a file is uploaded from Amazon S3, for example, it's not something you can remember by heart. So we have a tool tool is called SemLocal that you can use to generate these synthetic events. And you can also use that to run your functions locally. We provide you Docker containers that reproduce the environment of Lambda so that you can run your functions locally on your laptop. It supports everything where you can run Docker, so Linux, Windows, or Macs. And in this way, you can do unit testing locally. Then what I suggest usually is if there is a build phase, put your unit testing there. And then depending on the complexity of your application, you can have one or more test environments where you test synthetic transactions that are not based on single function anymore, but will cross or multiple functions, and you probably have some database that you can always start with the same data and reproduce the synthetic transaction. And in this way, you can do the step further, also to test the integration of everything. And the final step is I always suggest to do canary or linear deployments in production, because with microservices in general and also with serverless, it's simply impossible to test every use case in a synthetic environment. And the suggestion that I usually give there is the same that I got from Netflix, for example, is test your business metrics, not just your infrastructure metrics. So if you want to see if a canary deployment is working, find the 1, 2, maybe 3, not more, business metrics that tells you if your application is working or not. So, for example, for Netflix, the number of play per second, so the number of times that people is starting a playback of a video is their master metric. If they see that this value is changing with some statistical significance compared to what they expect, then probably they broke something with the release. And then you can use these canary frameworks to roll back immediately to the previous version. And you can also automate this with alarms, for example.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And that's also something that we are advocating, and where, obviously we come from it with our monitoring background. We support canary releases where we can actually monitor your regular traffic, and then we also know what is the traffic that goes to your canary. And then we give you the metrics split up, and we can compare it, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I like what you said. Infrastructure is one piece, monitoring, right? How is your infrastructure doing? But more importantly is what is the actual impact on the end user, and that's very important to understand these metrics. Can you remind me again, though? Maybe you've mentioned it earlier, but for our listeners out there, the canary frameworks that you have, is this from an AWS perspective? Do you provide something within AWS? Is this something that is built, for instance, in the API gateway that allows routing a certain part of traffic to the canary versus the regular version, or is there an additional canary framework or linear deployment framework that people have to use?
Oh, of course, people can use different frameworks, but there are two main approaches. One is in the API gateway. So this works, of course, for a web API, and you can do a canary deployment. And this is really for monitoring even long term. So you can keep the canary taking maybe 5% or 10% of your traffic live, not just for a few minutes. You can even keep it for a few days. And then you can do also A/B testing. So you can compare how the main population of users is behaving compared to the smaller population. So normally the rule there is use the smallest number of users for your canary deployment that can make a significant impact, and then you can grab some metrics out of them. So usually a few point percentage is okay. So this is for web APIs in the API gateway, and normally I suggest this not just for testing, it's more even for comparing how the new version is working for your users. So are they enjoying the new feature or not? And then we have something built within Lambda, and that's what we usually call safe deployments. And it's basically the automating deployments with versions and aliases. So if you use Lambda, we have for every function you can define multiple versions, and versions are immutable. So there's version 1, version 2, version 3 of your function. And then you can have an alias like production that links to one of those versions. So production is version 2, and I'm working maybe on a new version. What we added last year is the possibility to have an alias that can link two different versions with weights. So you can say production is now 95% version 2 and 5% is version 3. So a few users will see the new version of the function. And this is at Lambda level. Of course, this is useful, but it's difficult to orchestrate. So we integrated the management of this with code deploy and with SAM. So now basically in a template, you can just say all the functions of my serverless application, do a canary deployment with, as I said, like 10% of the users for 30 minutes or something like that. And then code deploy will automatically create the new version, will shift the traffic from the old version to the new versions. And you can add monitoring to that. So you can say if some alarms is raised, or if monitoring function that I can define that will monitor the environment before and after the release will sense something wrong, then you automatically roll back.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty cool.
Hey, Andy, I wanted to ask a question. Unless you had something follow up on that topic, I wanted to ask another question. But did you have any follow up on that one there?
I just have one quick one. So the traffic is if you're doing, let's say, 10% on the canary, is this sticky sessions? Do you also have session stickiness? That means the same user gets to, is kind of exposed to the same version, or is it just random round robin?
No, it's completely random round robin, and it's also at function level. So if a user to complete a transaction, it's where tools like DynaTrace can help you, to trace across different microservices. So if you go through 5 functions, for each function you can go on the old or the new version. So it's really a mixed up test. And in a way, for testing, I think it's good because you can test all the possible permutations. And one of the main characteristics of microservices is that you can independently deploy each function or each service from the others. So you're really testing that. If you want to test a coordinated set of microservices together, then canary releases with the API gateway is the way to go, because there you can say, okay, there is this new version with all the dependencies, and then if a user goes on the new version, we'll see only the new version of all the function of the microservices that build up my application.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool.
So I wanted to ask Andy, I forget who it was that was on. I think it was you and I talking. See, this is what happens when it's early morning recording for me. My brain doesn't quite work. But I believe we were speaking to somebody recently who was talking about they skipped over containers and went straight to serverless. Was that, do you recall that, Andy?
I think it was Fender, wasn't it Fender?
Oh, yes, that's it. Okay. So it was an interesting topic. Danilo, as they were going to the cloud, they said, all right, we see everyone's on containers, but we see serverless. We're going to just go straight for serverless. And what I wanted to find out from you is, I think, and I might be wrong, this is why I ask you, the expert, obviously, do you think whenever somebody's breaking or creating a microservices application, what guidance would you have, if any, to give to people to say certain things maybe you should run in a container and certain things should maybe run serverless? Is there a decision point to say, don't even bother doing this in serverless. Go ahead and then run that in a container.
Oh, well, we've seen lots of different workloads on serverless. And normally what I suggest customers, especially if they want to build something that is completely new, is write your serverless applications so that they are portable. So that the idea is just to apply the old style architectural patterns to the new architectures that now we have with containers and serverless. So in this case, it's the adapter model. So if you want to build something that runs as a function, you can just decouple for the event wrapper, so the part that is managing the event for the function, from your business logic, and then you can add a web interface, for example, to your business logic, and the same function can run in Lambda or can be Dockerized in a container. And this is, for example, I just published an article on Medium about that. About you can write the same code base and it can run and be tested even automatically on containers and functions. So technically, that's my suggestion, so that you don't force yourself to go only in one direction. But of course, with serverless, we've seen some common use cases where it's very easy to see the advantages. So whenever you're building a web application or a mobile backend, even an IoT backend, I don't know if you have one of those Roomba devices, but the Roomba devices, they are connected with AWS using IoT, and they use Lambda function for interacting with the backend. So mobile and IoT backends is a great use case. We've seen also data processing. Strangely enough, is something that it can really be interesting in a serverless architecture, because you can really scale from 0 to 1,000 or more functions working in parallel on your data, and then you scale down to 0 in a matter of seconds. And this is something that is quite interesting. There's a customer from the US that probably you know better than me. It's called Fannie Mae. It's the Federal National Mortgage Association. They do Monte Carlo simulations on their data on mortgage using Lambda function, and then they can scale up and down in a way that they really enjoy. And that's another interesting use case. Then we have chatbots. So probably the integration with Alexa, with Amazon Alexa, was probably one of the drivers. But we see lots of other platforms as well using serverless architecture for building chatbots, and to link the logic of the chatbot with maybe the interaction with the physical world. For example, when you want Alexa to do something. And another strange use case that I think it's really interesting, because usually it's really at cost zero, is all those old style automation scripts that we have in our infrastructures now to automate backup, moving data, cleaning up storage, those things that you put into some cron tab and they are executed. So I've seen a lot, especially in enterprise context, people starting to adopt serverless, replacing the scripts with functions that can be triggered with a cron schedule. And since there's a huge free tier with Lambda, you really don't pay anything, and you solve one of those problems of the scripts that sometimes they don't run because they are installed on one physical server and you don't know why. And using Lambda, you can put them in high availability, and you don't pay anything for that.
That's pretty cool. Actually, this was one of my use cases. I used Lambda in my DevOps scenario for basically linking different tools, right? And basically executing remediation actions. So what you said earlier with executing certain batch jobs to clean up things or to restart services, that's stuff that I built into Lambda. The other example that Brian brought up, so we talked with Fender, and I believe Fender is one of your, at least in the US, I know they have been invited to the AWS lofts in San Francisco to speak about their architecture. And we have him on podcast, and he was basically saying and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was saying they run their complete infrastructure for $80 a month on serverless, and another $80. Yeah, and another $80 for EC2, because they still have a couple of, let's say, monolithic pieces that they just run on EC2. And then that was just fantastic. And then we were all wondering, how does Amazon actually make money with these companies? Because $80 doesn't get that's obviously not a whole lot. I mean, it's fascinating.
Right, it's amazing. I mean, it's not an extremely large application. It's a smaller thing that they're running. It's not the entire Fender property, but it is still a significant, application set. And the fact that they're running it for $80, and that kind of ties in, Andy, to the biggest part of performance, right? I mean, obviously everyone likes response time as a key indicator of performance, but that goes doubly for serverless, because however long it's running is how much you're paying. So it becomes even that more important. And it's funny that you don't have to think about, well, what's the CPU utilization? It's just a different mindset, I guess. But
I have one question on lock-in. So a lot of the times when I talk with people, they say, well, we don't know if we should go with a certain vendor on serverless because we fear a lock-in. How do you counter that argument? Because you mentioned earlier, right? You can abstract all of your code, and there's frameworks out there that allow you to port things over. But I remember when I wrote my Lambda functions, there was a certain lock-in because I was using certain AWS libraries to interact with the rest of the AWS ecosystem. So what's the recommendations you give to enterprise companies that say we want to go serverless, but we also want to keep our door open to potentially move it to other vendors?
Yeah. So as I said, you can, from a code-based perspective, you can decouple the integration with the event platform that triggers your function from the business logic, and you can have the same code base running, for example, in Docker containers and in Lambda functions. So that's my top suggestion. On the other side, you get lots of things for free by using a serverless platform. So for example, if you deploy a function on Lambda, on AWS Lambda, it would be automatically scalable. So you don't need to set up a load balancer. You don't need to configure an auto scaling. From a security perspective, you give permission to each Lambda function to do something, like you can read data from this S3 bucket, you can write in this database table, and so on. So you also get this security control, very granular as part of the platform. You get versioning, the deployment that I said, and so on. So what I think is that one thing is of course, if you change platform, you will need to rebuild all those features because they were just there. But that's probably the main advantage, because especially small companies, when they start like a new startup building something, they can go out creating a prototype, and then the prototype is almost ready for production because security is built in, availability is built in, scalability is built in. If you want to leave the platform, then you will need to re-implement all those features.
No, that's great points, obviously. Yeah, cool. Danilo, is there anything else that you typically give developers when you talk with them, or people that make decisions on serverless, yes or no? Anything else that we have not covered today? Because I think the goal of this podcast is to tell people more about if serverless and when serverless, then best practices, like as you said, serverless by design. Anything else we missed?
Oh, of course, there's lots of different topics, but I think that the key idea for me for serverless is not just for cost reduction, like you said, but it's more for velocity and agility in development. I think someone once on Twitter was discussing like it's easier to build a prototype on Lambda than to discuss it on Twitter. So that's the main point. No, it's really a way to build something that is like 90% ready to go into maybe a controlled production environment, and that's the idea. So don't waste time maybe trying to set up some complex environment to support your idea. Just start and build it.
And because we have a lot of enterprise customers out there that obviously deal with their existing legacy applications, and what we see is people are now exploring different models on how serverless should be used in that respect. It's either building some new capability with serverless and then talking with the, let's say, legacy backend. Another approach that I've seen is if you know that you have a monolith and if there are certain features within that monolith that you would like to kind of innovate faster on, but you're constrained by the fact that it is within a monolith. I've seen, and have you seen this as well, people rebuilding certain features with Lambdas or with serverless, and then eventually kind of fading out the monolithic piece of it? Is that another interesting approach?
Yeah, definitely. This is part of an overall process of peeling the onions of the monolith. So you start by removing some features from the monolithic application, replacing those features with something that is smaller, faster, more granular, and Lambda function is definitely an option. So I've seen that done a lot. And for example, I remember, and the integration of serverless application with a legacy application is something that we were focusing with the new features that we launched last year. So for example, you can connect your Lambda function to your virtual network on AWS, or even with your on-premise network using tools like Direct Connect. So you can have network visibility from a Lambda function of your legacy application. And then you can also now control scalability. So because we often say with serverless that you can scale now from 0 to 1,000 concurrent execution in a few seconds. But if your legacy application is connected to those functions, maybe they don't like it very much. And so you now control the concurrency at function level. So for example, if you have a function that connects to your on-premise relational database, you can say, I don't want to have more than 100 concurrent connections because otherwise that can overload my database. And then you can manage maybe how these functions are invoked and absorb any delay with exponential backoff or these kind of strategies. But it's something that we did last year, especially for enterprise customers. And I've seen now interesting use cases in the area. For example, CocaCola, they built a serverless component to really absorb the speed of some application with their legacy consumer database. So I think this is a US only, but with Coca-Cola you can go to a vending machine and get credits when you get drinks. And they had the problem that these credits on a mobile app would go out of sync from what they had inside their database. And this was because they were just reading from the consumer database too quickly. So in this case, they used a state machine that is another feature that we have is part of the AWS step functions. The state machine would just wait for a few seconds before reading the updated value from the consumer database. And in this way, they integrated the new fast application that is for the mobile app with their slower legacy stuff.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, and Andy, another example I saw recently with a commerce application is where there's these background jobs running, right? It's more of a monolithic application, but this I thought was a really good use for it, where periodically, either once a day or once an hour, a job would run that would re-index the catalog, the inventory catalog. Mm-hmm. And instead of running that on the actual application so that every time that runs, that's suddenly stealing CPU and memory away from the application that's trying to run and serve the customers. And instead of putting that into a container that's going to be running up all the time, but only executing once every, however many hours or minutes or whatever, it was a perfect candidate. They took and threw that into a serverless function where it just runs and saved them a bunch. But it was really, really just novel. Like, when you're talking about in terms of looking for those ideal candidates to get started with, it could even be something like a background job, right?
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right. Brian, what do you think? Shall we sum it up?
Let's do it.
Let's summon the summarator.
Let's summon the summarator. So Danilo, the way this always works, it's just obviously with the background of me being Austrian and the Terminator and the Governator, we have the summarator. Thank you so much for educating us on serverless by design. What this means, I think I learned a lot today regarding that. First of all, there's the SAM project that we can go out. Also the serverless by design project that you built, where we can visually design our complete end-to-end serverless architecture, and then you actually create a CloudFormation template that helps me stand up everything. I think I learned a lot about how serverless in general, the real, I think, benefit is speed of innovation, allowing people to innovate faster on individual features or functions that they want to push out, exposing them to the outside world using canary releases. We learned that there's both on the API gateway capabilities to do canary releases, but also on the Lambda side itself, where you have the different versions and you can use the alias mapping. So that was very interesting. Coming back to the very beginning, where I struggled with my first adoption of serverless, we all have to understand really how event-driven architectures have to work, because otherwise you just run into classical mistake that I made in just calling different functions sequentially, and obviously that doesn't help anybody. There's more information out there, obviously, Danilo, that you put out, and there's more information, I assume, on the AWS website. Also, the serverless repository is a great way to see what type of serverless use cases are out there, some implementations that people can look into. And we also have our own Lambda functions out there. If you go to the AWS DevOps tutorial on GitHub, and you'll see that. Thank you so much for being part of Dev1 in Austria, and also thanks for joining us for our first AWS meetup in Linz, Austria, in June. Yeah, that's it. And thank you so much. It's been great conversation.
It's been my pleasure. So thank you so much. And if anyone listening here to this podcast will build something, just ping me on Twitter. It would be great for me to know.
And what's your Twitter handle?
It's Danilop. I'm very boring. I'm Danilop everything. Everywhere. On GitHub. It's even my email at amazon.com.
All right. Well, and we'll have that on the link to the Twitter handle on the thing, but we will not put a link to your email because then crawlers will get it and start spamming you. Thank you, Danilo. I have nothing extra to add. I think Andy did a great summary. I do want to though see if we can possibly encourage your superiors to make you dress up as the squirrel when you present.
Actually, the Tim Wagner, our director for the API Gateway and Lambda, he was dressed up as a squirrel at reInvent. And I think
awesome.
You can find pictures.
Well, then you're off the hook. Thank you for taking your time to talk with us today. We really appreciate it. And to all of our listeners, if you have any other questions, please contact Danilo. You can also send them to us, especially if you have topic ideas for another show or some topics you would like us to discuss and dive deeper into. We'd love to get some feedback. Anything else from anybody else, or are we all good here?
Good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.